Hello, and welcome to the Society for Economic Anthropology's Mergers and Acquisitions podcast. Each quarter, the podcast explores a particular topic that illustrates some of the ways anthropologists contribute to the study of economic life. Previous quarters have focused on climate finance, waste, entrepreneurship, and work and unemployment. These podcasts can be accessed by visiting the Society for Economic Anthropology's webpage. My name is Jenny Huberman, and this quarter, I'm speaking with some wonderful guests about capitalism in the digital age. Some of the questions we will be exploring include: how are digital technologies enhancing as well as disrupting processes of capital accumulation? How are they changing the way labor is experienced and exploited? Where should anthropologists be turning their attention, and what kinds of questions should they be asking in their efforts to understand how digital capitalism is produced, lived, and even resisted by those people who are differentially positioned within its ambit? Today, my guest is Sibel Kusimba. Sibel is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida, and she has spent much of her anthropological career doing research in Kenya. She's explored issues having to do with interethnic cooperation, to leadership, to environmental change, and even the origins of trade. Over the last decade, however, Sibel has been focusing on the impact of digital money and digital finance in Kenya. And this provides the departure point for her new and truly wonderful book, Reimagining Money, Kenya in the Digital Finance Revolution, which was published in 2021 by Stanford University Press. So, Sibel, thank you so much for making time to speak with me today and for agreeing to be the last guest on this podcast series devoted to capitalism in the digital age. I really appreciate you being here.
Jenny, it means so much to be a part of this. Thank you so much for thinking of me and for inviting me to participate.
So maybe you can begin by explaining why you wanted to write this book.
So I had been doing research in Kenya for a long time, as you noted. In fact, earlier in my career, I did a lot of archaeological work. I was looking at Ice Age hunter-gatherers. I was looking at stone tools and ostrich eggshell beads, things that seem pretty far away from the topic of the book. But I read a lot and thought a lot about social networks. What does it mean when people are connected, either by some kind of exchange process or some kind of artifact, or it could even be an idea? You know, how do people create webs of relationships? And what does that look like across space? And what kinds of material evidence could, say, an archaeologist find of all of these webs of interconnection? So a lot of my early work had been on that theoretical point. And when I went to Kenya in 2008 for a Fulbright, this new money transfer service had already been deployed and was already attracting a lot of usage and a lot of interest, mostly from development economists at the time. There weren't a lot of anthropologists writing about it, but I began to use it in particular to send money to my husband's relatives because my husband's Kenyan. And, you know, it really made me think a lot. It wasn't really the topic of my Fulbright year in Kenya, but using the service and thinking about how a way to send money might replace a visit, let's say, to your mother-in-law or something like that. I went back to that early work I had done, like dissertation and post-dissertation, about how a social network across space changes the way people interact, right? Changes the sense of space and time, changes the way a social group thinks about its boundaries, you know, and all these other things. And so I realized, you know, in particular, when asking people about money, money sending, I realized it was shifting and changing, that the layout of these relationships. I also realized that when people sent money, it got broken up into smaller amounts of money and then resent. And that was really similar to the stone tools that I had looked at, because like, one stone tool actually gets broken in half, like it's an obsidian blade or something, it gets broken in half. And then two people, you take the pieces of the stone tool and go off in different directions and things. And this was the same thing. Like you send money to your mother-in-law and she helps 6 different people. And so as I began to talk to people, I thought someone needs to draw this, right? And so, I started drawing the social networks, and really that's how, that's how I went about it. Was I realized that it could fit into my archaeology work, and maybe allow me to do something that was very current, which is I had always toyed with that idea. And I was always like really attracted to the Society of Economic Anthropology, I have to say, because it included, this study about of like exchange and trade. And, the society has always included quite a few archaeologists who are part of the society, as well as cultural anthropologists. And so I always felt really at home here, because it was a little bit cross subfield in terms of an audience. And so really that's how I got interested in it. And there was a research group at University of California, Irvine, headed by Bill Maurer, which is called the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion, which is still an extant institute. And I was so incredibly lucky to find out about this institute, because they ended up funding the research in the book, most of it. And then I even got things like, a little bit of travel money and stuff from them. So, I really want to thank IMTFI for all their support. They had these amazing conferences where you could go and just learn so much information from all these other people who were interested in this same topic of like money and financial technologies and digital money and things. So that's really the other big piece of the puzzle that enabled me to write this book, was finding a kind of community of practice of other people who were interested in this topic.
That's interesting, because I don't recall you discussing that connection with your earlier archaeological work in your book. I could be wrong about that, but I don't recall you making that explicit connection. And it's interesting because it really points to just what a longstanding tradition of exchange and networks and sociality there is in this part of the world. And I was thinking about how that, in a certain sense, makes something like a digital finance revolution more conducive. And the whole time I was reading your book, I was thinking about that. And I was thinking about how, Americans, I think, are much more hesitant or uncomfortable with the idea of borrowing money. They might send money to their friends via Venmo to pay for drinks they had on a night out. They don't seem as comfortable with this idea of a constant to and fro, a give and exchange. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit in more general terms about that sort of traditional culture of sharing and exchange and reciprocity, and perhaps how that sort of provided an elective affinity for the emergence of digital money and these new digital finance technologies in Kenya.
Sure. And I think you're very right. I've just moved to Florida, and my students here have told me that and these were a group of Puerto Rican students and Caribbean students, and they told me that when they go out for dinner, they have 2 ways of paying for it. If the person who invited everybody pays, and then, they simply resolve that debt maybe later on in the future when another member of the group might pay for something else. They call that the Puerto Rican way. But when they decide that everyone needs to pay their share right away, and they use Venmo or something to make or Cash App, to make sure that nobody has been left, with a debt, or that everyone has kind of resolved what they owe to the group. They call that doing things the American way, paying the American way, which I thought was really funny. I do think that's true. And it comes maybe from, our much longer experience with, money as, a way of completing or tying off or cutting off a debt and finishing, the debt. Whereas in other parts of the world, people are more used to these open-ended senses of obligation. In fact, they seek them out. Like someone might ask you, for your shirt, or give me your shirt, give me your shoes. And oh, I really like that sweater. Can I have that? Like, sometimes that's the way that people might initiate a friendship. And whereas we would think that's really rude, in many other places, it's considered an invitation to create a lasting kind of reciprocal relationship. And I do think those traditions of like interdependence, I guess, are really important here. And even theoretically, I knew I needed to get beyond some of the more negative views about money that even scholars have developed. And, anything relating to, Marxist traditions. And what I mean by Marxism here specifically is more the idea that, money is very toxic to social relationships, that money, evens things out and depersonalizes things and really removes the personal component of relationships. And I think we are very aware of that, and we're very mindful of that in the West because we've seen how destructive money can be. And in a lot of other parts of the world, money gets incorporated into existing, ideas of the gift and reciprocity and exchange. So it's a really neat way of bringing that anthropology into a contemporary example.
Yeah, and it ties back to your argument about, or your theoretical framing around this idea of wealth in people, and that these are places and these are people who view money as a means to creating relationships with others. And at the end of the day, the real source of value is another human being, which in a way is a very kind of beautiful indigenous critique of capitalism, right? It's sort of not what Marx was seeing. And so I think your work in part is so interesting and important because it makes an important intervention in challenging the idea that everything is gloom and doom. The system is getting even worse. It's becoming more and more about instrumental relationships. And so I really appreciated that part of your book. At the same time, you also draw our attention to the fact that the digital finance revolution in Kenya is creating problems, and that there have been sort of failures in this initiative. So maybe you could speak to some of those issues.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing is that, everyone got very excited about a new form of money. What could money on a mobile phone do that, say, paper and coin money cannot do? And, here I was really drawn to the work of Bill Maher, who has written a lot about, digital payment and just embedding all of those issues in anthropological theories. The issues are that in a lot of ways, the promise of new technology hasn't really borne out in many ways. And part of it is that the financial services industry has created a lot of the same kinds of consumer finance, products and ideas that, have already been prevalent historically with other kinds of money. And here, really what I'm talking about is the growth of a debt society around cheap credit. And unfortunately, that's been, one of the most important ideas in the development world, which is that, poverty is a problem of money, and specifically poverty is a problem of credit. The idea that entrepreneurs all over the world, need small loans to help them build up their businesses and so on. And so that's been one of the predominant models in terms of what to do with this new form of money. Well, let's give people loans or debt. More properly, we should really say that this is debt. And like one of the biggest, most popular products is, like a small loan that you can get on your phone, and you can get those instantaneously. You don't need any collateral. You can get $20, the equivalent at least, on your phone, and then you can kind of pay that back, and then gradually build up, a little bit of a credit history through your repayment history on the SIM card of your phone, right? And this is sort of a collaboration between banks and the mobile phone providers. And it's like anything else. It's true that some people have been able to use those loans productively for different things, but a lot of people are using these loans to survive, and they're unable to pay back even small amounts of money. And I do profile someone in the book. I try to give a sense of what it's like to not have an actual job. I think it's important to remember that many of the people who are using this kind of digital finance are sort of self-employed. They're in the informal economy. They're looking for ways to make a little bit of money buying and selling, selling their agricultural products. It's really a very precarious way of life. And so what you have is a kind of solution to poverty that is, being taken up by people who don't really have a secure and reliable income. So they're unable to repay these loans. Sometimes they just throw away their phone and hope that no one will chase them. But, really, that's not what including people in a system that works to alleviate poverty should really be about. So I think there are lots of problems. One of them is debt. Another one is, all these potential issues of the security of our personal information, how our digital identity is being used. I didn't get into a lot of these issues in terms of the actual research, but I do explain what the emerging problems are in the sector. And it's a lot of it has to do with the way we're all dealing with digital media in our lives, right? We've lost our privacy. We have risks of fraud and theft online. And so all of these are even more, I think, pressing in countries that just don't have good regulations, don't have good consumer protection. I mean, I think that's probably true of most countries, or all countries, perhaps. Like, in other words, all of these kinds of regulatory oversight has to constantly chase the business sector, which seems to be plunging ahead with new ideas. And, in a country like Kenya, the kind of development discourse has to sort of try to, absorb and evaluate everything that's happening with predatory apps and it's a very rapidly moving situation. And it was actually a real challenge to describe. I was dissatisfied with once you write a book, it's an ongoing story, but I was kind of dissatisfied with just how complicated that is and how hard it is to describe. But I'm glad you mentioned that I did try to do that.
Well, I'm curious with this whole idea of predatory lending, and I loved the book. I loved the chapter in your book on the rat and the purse, and the way that women who are using these new forms of microfinance understand this as a form of predatory lending. But I'm also wondering if it is changing sort of the discourse, the moral discourse around debt, because it seems what I glean from your work is that in, traditional times, people were constantly borrowing, exchanging, lending money. They were in debt to each other with the expectation that at some point there would be an attempt to make a reciprocal return. And I'm wondering if these companies are not just bringing new forms of predatory lending, but also new discourses about the immorality of being in debt. And if it's changing the way that users of these services are coming to understand themselves. I mean, in America, we find lots of talk about how people who can't pay back their debts are losers, they're irresponsible. And so I'm wondering if you saw any of that in your research.
I think that's a really good point. And that brings up, I think, immediately of David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where he really talks about the way that debt is, a form of subordination, right? A way of making people feel responsible for their own subordination, right? The word debt, in German comes from the word Schuld, which means sort of like my fault, my blame, right? And so, he goes into that, like debt as a way of disciplining people. And I think that's kind of the big question behind how successful these attempts to give out microloans will eventually be. Because one of the big questions is, well, if I owe money to my friend in that kind of previous tradition of the back and forth, is that the same kind of debt as it is when I owe one of these apps, money, and they keep sending me these text messages, to repay. And I think one thing we know is that many people, as I said, simply throw out their SIM card or just ignore them, or they just don't repay. So the lack of repayment has been a big problem in this sector. And a lot of these companies don't last and they go out of business because people don't repay their loans, which suggests that these people are not as amenable to being disciplined as we would like them to be, right? And they also use advertisements to try to change this moral discourse. For example, one advertisement sort of talks about how, a moral person doesn't ask their friends and relatives for help, right? A moral person needs to take out one of these loans and show responsibility, and a moral person should not burden their friends and relatives by asking them for help, right? And so that's a completely different way of seeing the morality of money than it was, in the previous time. So there is an attempt to kind of reacculturate people to a sense of debt as something bad and something shameful, which I think is, it's really a shame. And on the other side, it's also kind of, it's not really clear how successful they're going to be. But I do think there's been a lot of individuation, of money. They partly succeeded in advancing the idea that money is just this individual tool. It's and I think part of that is because a phone is a very individuated kind of instrument, for a lot of people. It's private. I can, check my balance and my spending behavior or whatever it is. And so really the technology might be asserting that idea that, money is something very individual and very private. So we could see shifts along those lines in terms of how people think about money.
I think you just talked yourself into a great new paper that you should write.
Let me take some notes. Okay. Yeah.
So one other thing I wanted to ask you about is you say in your book that one of the themes of your book is how, quote, money's material form changes its work in society. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a bit of a sense of how people think about mobile money as being different than cash, as being different than goats. How is it changing the way they think about the work that money does? I think that issue is really interesting. And I think it's an issue that's kind of hard to get at, perhaps ethnographically, but you're in a good spot to do it.
So, right. So let me think about that a little bit. Well, I think one way was the issue I just brought up, which is that the goats, and even cash money to an extent, they are visible or potentially visible. And this ended up being a very big theme across the work that I did was, when is money public and shared, and when is it private, when is it visible, and when is it invisible? So, in rituals and celebrations and ceremonies that are very long-standing here, money was actually very important in all of those. And oftentimes public display was expected and prescribed, whether you're, giving a gift of animals or could also be cash money. And what I found was that people really saw the kind of private and invisible nature of digital money as it was very unsatisfying for them. And yet it could also be used strategically, to do certain things that may be considered, illicit or frowned upon. And so the best way that I was able to draw this out is to study rituals. So, what people do, people will send money and then they'll say, make sure you go and buy a calf of the appropriate size, for this ritual. And, people still, in fact, make quite a great show of the display of animal gifts, particularly in this area of Western Kenya, where I did a lot of my research among Luhya-speaking Bantu people. And there are lots of continuing extant traditions about the exchange of cattle and other livestock, which are still a really important form of money. And it's kind of interesting because rather than the digital money taking over and making these other kinds of money disappear, in fact, the digital money circulations, it's so easy to kind of pool money, ask people for money, get a lot of donations. It almost enables people to continue their traditions and breathe new life into them, because now people can fundraise for enough money to get the goat or the cow, and then, put the patterned flowered cloth on the goat and the cow and put flowers in their horns and have the parade. Everything is almost even more answerable to some of these traditions, because the money flows are kind of behind the scenes. They might enable someone who doesn't have enough money to easily fundraise from the social network, and then they can come up with this cow that they might not have been able to come up with before, right? So it's rather than a story of replacement, it's really about fitting this new kind of money into a kind of repertoire where many different kinds of money are employed and, used and shuffled back and forth, if you will. So I think visibility and invisibility, privacy as well as collective, the personal fund and the collective fund. And, all of this is about driving a wedge a little bit and creating more of a cultural space for things that are private and things that are very individuated and things that are very personal, which is a very, very sensitive area for a lot of the people I talk to. It's very, very delicate to do things that are personal and private. People might wonder what you're doing, who are you sending money to? Is this an extramarital affair, or why are you doing this, right? And so it's very delicate in terms of negotiating a licit space for personal and private things.
Which again strikes me as the inverse of how Americans think about money. It's you don't talk about it, it's your private, nobody's supposed to know what's going on with your money.
Right. It's so true. And actually something I saw just very recently about that was that when I saw an article about salaries in organizations, and they were saying that if colleagues shared their salaries with each other, there might be real shifts in terms of how they work with each other, or it could really shift social relationships, possibly positively, right? So there is something good to the idea of making everything open, to the eyes of others, and I think we don't do that enough. And I think again it goes back to what Graeber was saying about the shame of money and the way that it evaluates us and judges us personally. So we hate it for that reason.
Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons I was so excited to include you in this series on capitalism in the digital age, because I think there's a tendency for people to associate the digital age and the innovation of digital technologies with the West, with places like Silicon Valley. and that in the popular imagination, Africa is somehow imagined as existing outside of this sphere of technological innovation. Or, as you point out in your book, if it is recognized, the narrative seems to be that the West has brought all of these things to Africa. But as you point out in your book, in Kenya, people are really eager to reject this narrative, and they are very much interested in emphasizing the fact that the digital finance revolution was, in fact, a product of local creativity. And it wasn't something that was gifted to them by outsiders. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why this is important to them and why it's important at a more theoretical level, because it seems that what you're describing here is a situation where these technological innovations in finance take on not only economic significance, but political significance, and they become part and parcel of reproducing or trying to challenge these kind of racialized narratives of progress and innovation. And when I interviewed Jim Smith about his work on, the digital age in now I'm blanking on what
Central Africa.
In Central Africa, yes.
Yeah.
He was telling me that he also had similar reception when he was talking to people about the work he was doing. They're like, "What? You're studying digital age in Africa? What?" So maybe I was wondering if you could speak a little to that.
No, great. No, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think on one level, I think it really the people who use this money system played a big role in the innovation of the system. And this is a story that I detail in the beginning, how initially this digital money was really airtime credit, and you would use a scratch card, to reveal a code. You could put that into your phone, and then you could translate that code into a little bit of airtime. And really what people began to do was send and trade the airtime credits to friends and relatives. And it could be a way of sending money to someone far away to give them the code. By sending airtime, then that person on the receiving end might use it to as a means of exchange. Some people were accepting airtime credits as money in the marketplace, for example. So initially, it was the users who designed the system in a way, or they innovated the idea of digital money, which is kind of cool. It wasn't invented by the engineers. It was invented by users of airtime credits who said, "Hey, this airtime could be like a means of exchange, a form of money, and I could, send and receive this using a text message." So like in a very real way, the innovation was a ground up innovation. Of course, the engineers and the platforms sort of made it more systematic and more formalized, right? As a system that you would pay for, and then, certain service would be guaranteed to you in terms of the money sent and so on. So it became much more formalized, but absolutely, the users are the innovators here, and in this kind of view, and it's not always true, of course. And I'm really indebted again to the scholars at the IMTFI, because this was really very much part of the vision of that perspective, was to see what people are doing and, how technologies are actually used and employed is really very important to understanding what they are and what they end up doing for people. And absolutely, for Kenyans, it really means a lot to them to be included in these discourses about innovation and progress and so on. In some ways, it does fulfill this very old and tired evolutionary narrative in some ways. That is still one of the downsides of the way people talk about technological change and is such a stubborn trope in terms of how we think about where innovation comes from. I forgot the end of what I was going to say, but I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit. And it's actually very, very important for Kenyans to be known as like a site of innovation. It's very, very important to them. Yeah. And I think a lot of things are being innovated in developing settings, in different forms of insurance, loans and cooperative financial arrangements and so on that are like newly being used.
So I want to ask you a question that I've been asking all of my guests, and it's a broad question, but one of the purposes of this whole podcast, Mergers and Acquisitions podcast, is to provide a forum for anthropologists to talk about what anthropology can bring and what anthropological perspectives and methods can bring to the study of economic life. So, in your opinion, what do you think an anthropological approach can bring to the study of digital finance or economic life more generally? Why is anthropology important?
Well, I think culture is important, and I think that it's not so much that I disagree completely with the foundational approach of economics per se, but I think that we need to incorporate culture into the idea of like very basic decision making and our whole idea of what rational economic action needs to be. We really need to understand context, and we really need to think more inductively or more in a more exploratory way about what makes what kinds of behavior might be economically efficient or economically rational. Those are ideas that are not absolute or universal. They depend completely on the context that an actor is in. What kind of social role does that actor have? Does that actor belong to, I don't know, a caste that is forbidden from selling in the street or something like that? Culture gives people the boundaries of what kind of behavior is allowed or not allowed. And it also sets up the system of rewards whereby certain kinds of behavior would be considered, meaningful or rational or desirable. You can't separate those ideas from, how you look at behavior. And, I think the approach to digital money, the approach to, poverty alleviation through finance that I talk about in my book, and of course, it's a very broad discourse of many different approaches and everything. But, in general, they think of like rational action just in such a very limited and narrow way. They don't understand that, that maintaining relationships for the long term might be much more important than some short-term gain, over the period of weeks or months. That rationality is oftentimes a kind of long-term sense of like, okay, what is my economic interest? It might be in terms of staking a very long-term claim to belonging in a group rather than, how much money am I going to make this week or this month or something like that. So, there are many different scales around which, people think about what is rational or what is beneficial. There's many different social relationships that constrain what people can do and what they can't do. We just need to sort of resolve some of the disciplinary boundaries, I think, that keep economists and anthropologists from talking past each other. It's really, really hard. I'm not quite sure, how to do that necessarily. But I mean, I think that like the economists have looked at, for example, these money networks, that I've drawn, and they said, oh, well, it's risk reduction, because, like I'm sort of exchanging money across a social network. So my overall risk is reduced, right? Because I become part of a gigantic pool that sort of shares access to this money. right? So there's a concept that is, pretty much the same as what anthropologists talk about, right? So there's definitely like ways that these two disciplines could intersect more. And I think it's got to begin, though. It's got to begin with making a space to talk about culture and the fact that not all people are just the same all the time.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with that. Do you think there's anything that anthropologists could learn from economists?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that anthropologists, part of our problem, to be quite frank, is methodologically, I think we could have a lot to learn from economists. And I have used, for example, a financial diary approach in some of my research. So, to try to think of ways to sort of standardize the kind of information you collect from people, to think more about the cases that you create through ethnography. Are those cases representative, for example, of the diversity of different kinds of people that you want to be thinking about and that you want to be writing about? So like the network studies I've done, the financial diaries that I did. Okay, here I took 40 families. Let's try to collect the same amount of information from each household, and, those are a little bit standardized methodologies that, anthropologists actually played a very big role in developing. But I think that we may have gotten away from some of those methodologies with the rise of very humanistic ethnography. We got away from some of those. Not that that's bad, but there could be a balance, in terms of how you write. And so, like, for example, when I did the financial diary study, I had the famous Financial Diaries book by Susan Collins in mind. I've forgotten what that book is called now. I'm completely blanking out. But anyway, financial diaries are a sort of a systematic methodology where you try to collect the same amounts of information from a relatively large sample, of informants or households. So those kinds of standardized and, a little bit quantitative studies, I think are anthropologists should do them more routinely. And instead we teach our students that, it's got to be Clifford Geertz or it's nothing. And I think we just do need to be more to help students think more rigorously about how they collect their information.
Mm-hmm. One last question. It's a big one. Drum roll. What is next for you?
So I am really fortunate that I happened to meet a group of Kenyan diaspora Kenyan immigrants here in the U.S. who have developed an investment bank. And I'm studying this bank, just started working with them, and they're amazing. And we're going to write a lot of things together probably. But you have to be Kenyan to be a member of this bank, and you have to be a woman to be a member of this bank, which is kind of cool. And in fact, when they were registering their savings club, the Kenyan government really did not want them to, it's against the law to not have, to sort of practice gender discrimination, but they really stuck to their guns. And so now they have registered an investment club that is like a women-only investment club. So, and they're really an interesting group. So I am beginning, what I hope is another project describing, what they're doing. And they're really beyond finance. They're beyond financial inclusion. They're about assets. They want to create, they want to build apartment buildings and, malls and so I'm reading this book, Assetization, just all about what it means to create a durable asset, for your heirs and things like that. So I'm actually studying this diaspora bank, which is what I'm doing right now. So it's really, really interesting.
That sounds like it'll be a great project.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And again, I hope everybody goes out and buys your book and uses it to teach in economic anthropology courses because it is a gem. And I will be very excited to see how this project develops. And I wish you the best of luck with it.
And Professor Huberman, thank you so much for including me in this really great series and this wonderful review that you've written. And I really so much appreciate your interest. And it was really wonderful talking to you today. In fact, you've given me all these new ideas.
Thank you.